The story I used to think that the worst thing in the world was to be lonely, but I was wrong. The worst thing is to be surrounded by people who make you feel alone, to be a ghost in your own life story. For 10 years, my world was a quiet beige room in a building that smelled of disinfectant and regret. For 10 years, my own son and his wife treated me like a piece of furniture they were obligated to dust off once a month. They smiled with their teeth, but their eyes were always looking at their watches. They held my hand, but their touch was as cold as a key turning in a lock. I was their problem, their duty, their burden, and I suffered in silence, believing this was my final chapter. But they underestimated the woman I used to be and the love a good man left behind. They forgot that even the quietest voice can learn to roar. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My world had shrunk to the size of a single room. 4 walls, a window overlooking a manicured lawn I never walked on, and a television that chattered away to fill the silence. For 10 years, this room at the Golden Sunset Senior Residence was my entire universe. My son David and his wife Susan had called it a residence, a word that sounded so much more cheerful than what it was, a waiting room for the end of life. They chose it for me right after my husband, Robert, passed away. It's for the best. Mom, David had said, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt more restraining than comforting. You won't have to worry about a thing. We'll handle everything. And they did. They handled the sale of my car, the packing of my belongings, most of which ended up in a storage unit I never saw, and the management of my finances. They handled everything except me. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last. I'd wake up, get dressed with the help of a rotating cast of aides who were always too rushed to learn my name, and make my way to the communal dining hall. I'd sit at my designated table, often alone, pushing food around my plate that was designed for sustenance, not joy. The other residents were much like me, lost in their own fogs of memory and medication. We'd offer each other weak, watery smiles, the unspoken understanding of our shared predicament passing between us. We were all waiting for a visit, waiting for a phone call, waiting for it all to be over. My son's visits were the punctuation marks in the long, rambling sentence of my life. They came maybe once a month, always on a Sunday afternoon. David and Susan would walk in, bringing with them the scent of the outside world of gasoline, perfume, and a life I no longer had access to. Hi, Mom. You're looking well, Susan would say, pecking the air near my cheek. How are they treating you, Mom? David would ask, already glancing at his phone. The questions were always the same, and they never waited for a real answer. My response became a well-rehearsed script. Everything is fine, dear. The food is ... nutritious. The staff is ... busy. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. I couldn't tell them about the deep, aching loneliness that settled in my bones, a chill that no blanket could warm. I couldn't describe the feeling of being utterly invisible, of my opinions and desires having vanished along with my independence. How could I explain that the nutritious food tasted like cardboard, or that the busy staff sometimes forgot my medication or handled me with an impatience that bordered on cruelty? How could I tell my only son that his carefully constructed solution for my old age felt like a prison sentence? To do so would be to complain, to be a burden, and I have learned over the last decade that being a burden was the greatest sin an elderly parent could commit. They controlled my finances completely, my pension, my social security. The savings Robert and I had painstakingly built over 50 years of marriage, it all went into an account they managed. They gave me a small allowance each month, deposited onto a prepaid card. It was enough for a few toiletries, a new paperback, or a treat from the facility's small snack shop. It wasn't enough to give me any sense of freedom. Once, I had asked about seeing a detailed statement. Susan had laughed, a light tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. Oh, Eleanor, don't you worry your pretty little head about that. It's all very complicated. We're taking care of it. That's all you need to know. I was 82 years old, but they treated me like a child to be managed, placated, and kept quiet. The silence was the worst part. I have once been a woman full of opinions, a woman who had managed a household, raised a son, volunteered at the library, and debated politics with my husband over the dinner table. Now my voice had shrunk. It felt rusty and unused. In my conversations with David and Susan, I found myself nodding and agreeing, trimming my sentences down to the bare minimum to avoid causing any trouble or prolonging their already brief visits. Watched them from my window as they left, walking briskly to their expensive car. They never looked back. As their car pulled away, the silence they left behind was always heavier than the silence that had been there before. In that crushing quiet, I wasn't a mother or a widow or a woman named Eleanor. I was just a monthly obligation now fulfilled, and there was nothing to do but return to my room and wait for the next visit. For the next time, I would be reminded of the vibrant life I had lost. One Tuesday, a day no different from 1,000 others, one of the aides announced she was cleaning out a small storage closet on our floor. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice brisk, "there's a box in here with your name on it. From when you first moved in. Do you want it, or should we toss it?" My heart gave a little flutter. A box. I had assumed everything I owned was in that mysterious off-site storage unit. "I'll take it," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly firm. A few minutes later, a dusty cardboard box sat on the floor of my room. It was filled with odds and ends I hadn't seen in a decade. A few framed photos, a chipped porcelain bird Robert had won for me at a county fair, and my old gardening gloves, still faintly smelling of earth. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of old greeting cards, lay something I thought was long gone. It was a small leather-bound diary. The leather was soft and worn, the color of rich coffee. On the cover, embossed in gold, were my initials. Evie Robert had given it to me on our 25th wedding anniversary. "For your thoughts, Ellie," he had said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "They are too precious to be lost to the wind." My hands trembled as I opened it. I hadn't written it for years, not since before he got sick, but I didn't need to. The first half of the book was filled with his handwriting, not mine. For the first year after he gave it to me, he had secretly written in it himself, leaving me notes. It had been his private project, a testament to our life together. I ran my fingers over his familiar, elegant script. It felt like touching his hand again. I settled into my armchair, the one place in the room that felt like mine, and I began to read. October 12th. Eleanor convinced old Mr. Henderson from down the street to finally let her repot his prize-winning orchids today. He's a stubborn old goat and trusts no one with his plants. But he trusts my Ellie. She has a way with living things, plants, animals, people. She sees the life in them and knows just how to make it flourish. She came home with dirt on her nose and a smile that could have powered the whole city. I love that smile. A small, watery laugh escaped my lips. I remembered that day. Mr. Henderson had been so grumpy, but I had persisted, and in the end, he had been so grateful. I have forgotten that feeling of gentle, stubborn competence. I turned the page, November 5th. Our son David brought home a report card today that wasn't his best. He was afraid to show us. Eleanor sat him down, not with anger, but with a cup of hot cocoa. She didn't lecture him about his grades. She asked him what he was passionate about, what made his eyes light up. They talked for an hour about building model rockets. She told him that passion was the engine and hard work was the fuel. She has such a deep well of wisdom in her. She doesn't just raise a son, she nurtures a soul. I hope he always remembers that. A lump formed in my throat, David, my son. He had loved those model rockets. When had that boy, the one with eyes full of passion, turned into the man with eyes full of impatience? Reading Robert's words, I saw my son not as the 50-year-old stranger who managed my money, but as the little boy I had nurtured. The pain of that contrast was a physical thing. I read for hours, losing track of time. The beige room faded away, and I was back in my own home, in my own life. I was the woman who could fix a leaky faucet, who could bake a perfect apple pie from scratch, who organized the neighborhood watch, who held her husband's hand through storms and sunshine. One final entry near the end of his writings made me stop. My breath caught in my chest. July 21st. We had a scare today. A little dizzy spell for me, nothing more, the doctor said, but it got me thinking. If I ever go first, I worry about my Ellie, not because she isn't strong, she's the strongest person I know. I worry because her heart is so big, she sometimes puts everyone else's needs before her own. She will give until she has nothing left, so I'm making her promise me something tonight. I'm going to tell her, Ellie, never let anyone extinguish your light. Never let anyone make you feel small. Your voice is meant to be heard. Promise me you will always, always honor the magnificent woman you are. Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto the worn leather cover. I remembered that night. I remembered making that promise, thinking it was a silly, sentimental thing to say, because of course I would never let anyone do that. I was Eleanor Vance, Robert's wife, David's mother. A force to be reckoned with, but I had broken my promise. For 10 years, I had let my light be extinguished. I had let them make me feel small. I had silenced my own voice until I could barely hear it myself. The woman Robert described in these pages, the capable, wise, vibrant woman, was a stranger to me now. But as I sat there, clutching the diary to my chest, something shifted inside me. The tears were not just of sorrow, but of a slow, burning anger. An anger at David and Susan for what they had done, but more than that, an anger at myself for letting them. Robert's words were not just a memory. They were a call to action. He was reaching across time, reminding me of the promise I had made. The diary wasn't just a voice from the past. It was a key to the cage I had allowed to be built around me. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the desire to use it. The very next week, as if the universe had decided to test my newfound resolve, the letter arrived. It was a crisp, formal notice slipped under my door, announcing a cost of living adjustment for all residents. The fees for the Golden Sunset senior residents were increasing by 15%, effective the 1st of next month. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I knew what this meant. It meant a phone call, a visit, and another conversation where I would be made to feel like an expensive, inconvenient piece of luggage. Sure enough, that Sunday, David and Susan arrived. They wore matching expressions of strained seriousness. Susan was holding a file folder, and David didn't even bother with his usual hollow pleasantries. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed as if he couldn't wait to leave. Susan opened the folder on her lap. "Eleanor, we got the notice about the fee increase. It's quite substantial." She said the word substantial with an air of personal injury, as if the money were coming directly from her own pocket. "We've run the numbers," David continued, picking up the narrative. Frankly, with this new cost, your accounts are going to be running at a deficit each month. It's just not sustainable. I stayed silent, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. Robert's diary was on my nightstand, and I could feel its presence like a warm hand on my back. I waited. So, Susan said, looking at a spreadsheet in her folder, we've discussed it, and really, there's only one logical option. It's time to sell the house. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The house, my home, the place where Robert and I had built a life, where I had raised David, where every nook and cranny held a memory. I had always held on to the hope that the house would go to my granddaughter, Lily. She was David's daughter from his first marriage, a sweet girl whom I adored but rarely saw. David and Susan kept her at a distance, claiming the long drive was too much for her. I knew it was because Susan didn't like being reminded of David's past. The house was meant for Lily, I said, my voice quiet but clear. David sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. Mom, be realistic. Lily is a teenager. What is she going to do with a house? The market is good right now. Selling it is the responsible thing to do. The money from the sale will cover your expenses here for the foreseeable future. It solves the problem. It solves the problem. I was the problem. My continued existence was the problem. This isn't up for debate, Mom, David said, his tone hardening. The power of attorney gives us the authority to make these decisions for your financial well-being. We've already spoken to a realtor. They were so clinical, so detached. There was no sadness, no nostalgia, no acknowledgement of what that house represented. It was just an asset to be liquidated, an item on a spreadsheet. For a moment, the old Eleanor, the quiet and compliant Eleanor, wanted to nod and say, if you think it's for the best, dear. But Robert's voice echoed in my mind. Never let anyone make you feel small. I need to think about it, I said. Susan snapped the folder shut. There's nothing to think about, Eleanor. It's already in motion. We just wanted to inform you. The finality in her voice was like a slap. They left soon after, leaving the scent of their smug finality in the air. I sat there, stunned and shaking, not with sadness, but with a white-hot rage. As was my habit, I went to the window to watch them leave. They were walking down the long hallway toward the exit. They must have thought they were out of earshot, but the acoustics in these sterile halls were unforgiving. I heard Susan's voice, sharp and excited. That was easier than I expected, she said. The realtor said we should clear at least $200,000 after covering her long-term care fund. Then I heard David laugh. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, a genuine, unburdened laugh. I know, he said. Can you believe it? Hello, Mediterranean cruise. We can finally book the master's suite. Susan giggled. Greece and Italy, here we come. It'll be a nice bonus for all the stress she's put us through. The world went silent. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. A cruise. A luxury cruise. They weren't selling my home to take care of me. They were selling my home, my legacy, Lily's inheritance to fund their vacation. The stress of managing my life from a distance was a burden that required a bonus in that moment. 10 years of suppressed pain, of quiet indignation, of lonely afternoons, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that it didn't break me. It forged me. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass, a frail old woman in a beige room. But behind her, eyes afire had just been lit. The long silence was over. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness, my compliance for contentment. They had made a terrible mistake, and I was going to make sure they knew it. For the rest of the day, I was numb. The shock of their words, hello, Mediterranean cruise, played over and over in my head like a scratched record. It was a level of selfishness so deep, it was almost incomprehensible. They weren't just neglectful, they were predatory. My home wasn't a solution to their problem. It was the prize at the end of a long and tedious game. I ate dinner alone in my room, not trusting myself to be around others. The anger I felt was a living thing, a hot coil in my chest. It would have been so easy to let it curdle into despair, to simply give up and accept my fate as a casualty of their greed. I could picture myself withering away in this room, becoming the ghost they already saw me as Dot, but then my eyes fell on the diary. I picked it up, its familiar weight a comfort in my hands. I opened it to a random page, and Robert's words looked up at me. March 2nd. Ellie stood up to the city council tonight over their plan to cut down the old oak tree in the park. She had a petition with 200 signatures. She was nervous, I could tell, but her voice was strong and clear. She spoke about roots, about shade, about history. She made them see the tree not as an obstruction, but as a landmark. They voted to save it. She came home glowing, full of a fierce, beautiful power. My Ellie, the defender of trees and lost causes. I closed my eyes. The defender of trees. When had I stopped defending anything, especially myself? The woman in that story felt a million miles away. But the memory was real. The strength was real. It was still in me, buried under a decade of silence and sorrow. I just had to dig it out. The next morning, a young woman I hadn't seen before came in to help with my morning routine. She had warm, dark eyes and a smile that reached them. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," she said cheerfully. "My name is Maria. I'm filling in for a few weeks." Unlike the others, she didn't rush. She moved with a gentle efficiency, her touch respectful. She talked to me as she worked, asking me about the photographs on my dresser. "Is this your husband?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yes," I said, my voice thick. "That was Robert." "He has a very kind face," she said, and her sincerity was a balm on my raw nerves. Over the next few days, Maria was a quiet, constant presence. She noticed things. She noticed I wasn't eating and brought me a cup of soup she'd warmed up in the staff kitchen, saying it was her mother's recipe. She noticed I was having trouble with the fine print in a book and brought me a large print novel from the library cart. She was the first person in years who had looked at me and seen a person, not a task. One afternoon, she found me sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, the notice of the fee increase crumpled in my fist. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Vance?" she asked gently. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was her genuine kindness. Maybe it was the fact that my anger had burned away my fear. But the dam inside me finally broke. The story of the past 10 years, of the loneliness, the financial control, the calculated visits, and finally, the overheard conversation about the cruise came pouring out of me. I told her everything, my voice shaking with a decade of unshed tears and unspoken rage. I expected her to look uncomfortable, to make an excuse and leave, but she didn't. She pulled up a chair and listened. She listened with an intensity and empathy that I hadn't experienced from anyone, not even my own son, in a very long time. When I finished, my voice a hoarse whisper, she simply reached out and placed her hand over mine. "That is not just wrong, Eleanor," she said, and the use of my first name felt like a gift. "That is illegal. It's called elder financial abuse." The words hung in the air between us. Illegal. I had thought of it as cruel, as selfish, as a betrayal. But I hadn't dared to give it such a powerful official name. What could I do? I asked, the question feeling both momentous and terrifying. "They have all the control. They have the power of attorney." Maria's expression was firm. "A power of attorney is for your benefit, not theirs. If they are not acting in your best interest, it can be challenged. You have rights, Eleanor." She hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "My uncle is a paralegal. He works for a nonprofit, a legal aid service that helps seniors. They specialize in this kind of thing. They could give you advice. No charge. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in my chest. For the first time, I saw a path forward. It was a dark and frightening path, leading to a confrontation I never imagined I'd have to face. But it was a path. It was a way out of the beige room. Would you would you help me call them? I asked, my voice barely audible. Maria squeezed my hand. Her smile was fierce and beautiful, just like the one Robert had described. I'd be honored. She said, it's time someone started defending you. In that small, quiet act of trust, in the simple kindness of a near stranger, the plan began to take root. The woman who had been silenced for a decade was finally finding the courage to ask for help, to find her voice, and to start the fight for her life. The next day, Maria came to my room during her lunch break. She held out her personal cell phone to me, a silent offering. My heart hammered against my ribs. Making this call felt like stepping off a cliff. For 10 years, every decision had been made for me. To deliberately act against my son, to seek outside help, was a rebellion of the highest order. My hand trembled as I took the phone. Maria had already written the number on a slip of paper. Ask for Mr. Chun, she said softly. He's the senior specialist. Just tell him your story. Be honest. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and sharp in my lungs. I punched in the numbers, each beep sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. Room. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. Senior Legal Services, how can I help you? I'd like to speak with Mr. Chun, please, I stammered. My name is Eleanor Vance. A moment later, a man's voice, gentle but firm, came on the line. This is Arthur Chun. How can I help you, Mrs. Vance? And so, for the second time in as many days, I told my story. But this time, it was different. Bolstered by my conversation with Maria, I found a new strength in my voice. I laid out the facts, the move to the facility, the seizure of my financial assets, the minuscule allowance, the lack of transparency, and finally, the plan to sell my home to finance a cruise. I spoke of my late husband's wishes and the promise I had made to him. Mr. Chun listened patiently, interjecting only to ask for a clarifying detail, a date, a specific name. He didn't rush me. When I finished, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice resonating with a calm authority that soothed my frayed nerves. Thank you for calling us. I want you to know that you have done the right thing. Based on what you've told me, Maria was correct. This is a classic case of elder financial abuse and a severe breach of fiduciary duty under the power of attorney. He explained the legal terms in simple language. He told me that David and Susan's duty was to act solely in my best interest, not their own. Using my assets for their personal enrichment was not just immoral, it was against the law. What can we do? I asked, the we sounding strange and wonderful to my ears. We have several options, he explained. First, we can petition the court to have you declared competent and revoke the current power of attorney. Second, we can demand a full accounting of your finances for the last 10 years. And third, we can put a stop to the sale of your house. Immediately. Each word he spoke was like a brick being laid on a new foundation of hope. He was building a fortress around me where before there had only been crumbling walls. The diary you mentioned, he said, the one from your husband, and your own detailed memory of events, that is powerful. It speaks to your state of mind, your clarity, and your long-standing wishes. That is your evidence, my evidence. My diary wasn't just a collection of memories. It was my proof of life, my proof of sanity. Robert was still helping me, still fighting for me. Over the next week, a quiet revolution took place in room 2B. Maria became my co-conspirator. She helped me print out my bank statements from the limited online access I had. The statements only showed the small allowance they gave me, but it was a start. She brought me a notebook, and at Mr. Chun's direction, I began to write everything down. I documented every dismissive conversation, every lonely holiday, every time I had asked for information and been brushed aside. The act of writing it all down was transformative. It took the vague, heavy fog of suffering and turned it into a clear, factual list of injustices. Mr. Chun arranged a phone conference with me a few days later. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "the first step is a mediated meeting. We will invite your son and his wife to my office. It's often best to resolve these matters without a prolonged court battle, if possible. We will present them with our case and your terms. You will be there. Do you feel strong enough for that?" The thought of facing them, of looking my own son in the eye and accusing him, sent a wave of fear through me. The instinct to retreat, to go back to being quiet and avoiding conflict, was powerful. It was the path I had walked for a decade. Looked at the diary on my nightstand. I thought of Robert's belief in me. I thought of Maria's quiet courage on my behalf. And I thought of that Mediterranean cruise, bought with the pieces of my life. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "I am strong enough." Mr. Chun's voice warmed. "Excellent. I will draft the letters. We will give them 1 week's notice. Eleanor, you are no longer just defending yourself. You are taking back control. Let's get to work." When I hung up the phone, the room didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a war room. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the forgotten mother. I was Eleanor Vance, the client, the protagonist, the defender of my own life. And I was ready for battle. The day of the meeting, I chose my outfit with the care of a general preparing for a defining battle. I selected a navy blue dress, one of the few nice ones I had left. It was simple, elegant, and severe. Maria helped me with my hair, pinning it up in the classic style Robert had always loved. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a frail, elderly woman. I saw a matriarch. I saw a survivor. Maria drove me to Mr. Chun's office downtown. The ride was silent, but it was a comfortable silence filled with her unspoken support. The law office was in a tall glass building that seemed a world away from the low, beige sprawl of the Golden Sunset residence. We were shown into a conference room. Mr. Chun stood to greet me, a kind-faced man with sharp, intelligent eyes. He shook my hand firmly. "Eleanor, I'm glad you're here. You're doing a brave thing today." We sat on one side of a long, polished mahogany table. I placed my handbag on the floor beside me. Inside it was the leather-bound diary. It felt as heavy and powerful as a stone tablet of commandments. A few minutes later, the door opened, and David and Susan walked in. They stopped short when they saw me sitting there next to Mr. Chun. Confusion warred with annoyance on their faces. "Mom? What is this?" David asked, his eyes darting from me to the lawyer. "We got this bizarre letter from your office," he said to Mr. Chun. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake, David," Mr. Chun said calmly, gesturing to the chairs opposite us. "Please, sit down." They sat, perching on the edge of their leather chairs like wary birds. Susan clutched her purse in her lap, her knuckles white. "My client, Mrs. Vance, has asked for this meeting to discuss her financial affairs and her future care." Mr. Chun began. Susan let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Her affairs? We handle her affairs. She's perfectly well taken care of. Double quotes. Mr. Chun slid a file across the table. "This is a petition we are prepared to file with the court. It is to revoke your power of attorney on the grounds of breach of fiduciary duty and financial exploitation. It also requests a full court-ordered audit of all of Mrs. Vance's assets from the day you assumed control of them." David's face went pale. Susan's jaw dropped. "Exploitation? That's an outrageous accusation." She sputtered. Mr. Chun held up a hand. Before you respond, I think you should listen to what my client has to say. He turned his calm, reassuring gaze to me. Eleanor, this was it, the moment of truth. 10 years of silence had led to this single point. I took a slow, deep breath, and I looked directly at my son. For 10 years, I began, my voice lower and stronger than I had heard it in a very long time. I have lived in a room that you chose for me. I have eaten food that you paid for with my money. I have accepted the small allowance you grant me from my own life savings. And I have done it silently. I paused, letting the words sink in. David shifted in his seat, unable to meet my gaze. I kept silent because I didn't want to be a burden. I kept silent because you were my son, and I thought you were doing what was best for me. I was wrong. I looked from David to Susan, whose face was a mask of indignation. You did not act in my best interest. You acted in your own. You isolated me, you controlled me, and you made me feel invisible. My home, the home I built with my husband, the home I intended to leave for my granddaughter, Lily. To you, it is nothing more than a funding source for a vacation. At the word vacation, Susan flinched as if I had struck her. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and guilt. They knew I had heard. Mom, that's not ... we were just ... David stammered, his usual confidence completely gone. I am not a line item on your budget, I continued, my voice gaining power with every word. I am not a problem to be solved or a stress to be managed. I am your mother, and I am a woman who is perfectly capable of managing her own life. Robert, my husband, knew that. He knew my strength even when I had forgotten it. I reached into my handbag and placed the diary on the table between us. He left me a record of it. Mr. Chun took his cue. Here are our terms, he said, his voice crisp and businesslike. They are not negotiable. 1. You will immediately sign this document, voluntarily relinquishing your power of attorney. Mrs. Vance will be appointing a new independent financial advisor. 2. You will provide a full and complete accounting of all her assets within 30 days. Any ... discrepancies ... will be dealt with accordingly. 3. The sale of the house is cancelled, effective immediately. The property will be placed into an irrevocable trust for the benefit of her granddaughter, Lily, as per Eleanor's long-standing wishes. If you agree to these terms, Mrs. Vance has agreed not to pursue criminal charges for financial exploitation. The room was utterly silent. The threat, cloaked in legal language, was unmistakable. David stared at the documents on the table, his face ashen. He looked defeated. Susan, however, still had some fight in her. This is ridiculous, she hissed. She can't do this. She's not well. She's confused. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt not fear or intimidation, but a profound pity for her. Was I confused when I ran a household for 40 years, Susan? Was I confused when I managed a budget, paid the bills, and saved for the future? Or did I only become confused when my money became your money? My son wouldn't look at me. He picked up the pen on the table, his hand shaking. He looked at Susan, a silent, leading question in his eyes. She stared back, her face contorted with fury, but she gave a short, sharp nod. The legal and social humiliation would be too much. We all knew it. One by one, they signed the papers. They relinquished their power, their control, their decade-long reign over my life. As David pushed the signed document back across the table, he finally looked at me. His eyes were filled with a confusing mixture of shame, resentment, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years. The look of a little boy who knew he had done something terribly wrong, but it was too little, too late. As I stood up to leave, I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. I just felt ... free. The weight of 10 years of silence lifted from my shoulders. I walked out of that conference room and back into the sunlight, leaving them behind with the consequences of their own actions. I was walking back to my own life. Leaving the Golden Sunset Senior Residence felt like walking out of a black and white photograph into a world of vibrant color. The documents David and Susan had signed were more than just legal papers. They were my Declaration of Independence. With Mr. Chun's help, I found a financial advisor, a patient woman named Sarah who sat with me for hours, explaining the statements that David and Susan had hidden from me for a decade. It turned out they hadn't stolen as much as they had borrowed for themselves over the years, small amounts here and there that added up. But the bulk of my savings and my home were secure. I had more than enough to live comfortably on my own terms, and that's exactly what I did. I didn't want another residence. I wanted a community. I found a place called Willow Creek Gardens, a development of small, private apartments for active seniors. It had walking trails, a library, and most importantly, a large communal garden. My new apartment was filled with light. I spent the first week joyfully unpacking the boxes from that storage unit I had never been allowed to visit. My real furniture, my books, my paintings, my memories. As I hung the framed photo of Robert and me on the wall, I smiled. I had kept my promise. One of the first things I did was call my granddaughter. Lily, it's your grandma, Eleanor. Grandma. Her voice was full of surprised delight. Where are you? You sound ... different. I am different, my dear, I said, laughing. I'm in my new home, and I'd love for you to come and visit. I have something for you. She came the following Saturday. She was a beautiful young woman with Robert's kind eyes and my stubborn chin. We sat in my new sun-filled living room, and I told her everything. I told her about the house and how it was now safe and a trust for her. Her eyes filled with tears, not of pity for me, but of gratitude. Then I opened the diary. I want to read you something, I said. I turned to one of Robert's entries about a 5-year-old David, so full of wonder. Then I turned to an entry about me, about my strength. I wanted her to know the family she came from, a family of love and resilience, not just one of greed and neglect. I wanted her to know the real story. As I closed the book, I placed it in her hands. This is for you too, I said. So you never forget the kind of love that built this family and the kind of strength that runs in your veins. Life at Willow Creek was a revelation. I joined a book club. I took a watercolor class. I made friends, real friends, who wanted to know my opinions and hear my stories. We laughed over cups of tea and complained about our aching joints, but our complaints were drowned out by the richness of our days. My favorite place was the garden. The feeling of the cool, dark soil under my fingers was like coming home. I was assigned a small plot, and I filled it with tomatoes, lavender, and bright yellow marigolds. I found that my old skills, long dormant, came back to me easily. Other residents, seeing my success, started asking for advice. Soon, I was teaching an informal gardening class twice a week. One sunny afternoon, as I was showing a new friend named George how to properly prune a rose bush, I caught my reflection in the glass of the greenhouse door. I saw a woman of 83, her face lined with the map of a long life, her hands covered in dirt. Her posture was straight. Her eyes were bright, and on her face was a look of serene, quiet satisfaction. A knowing smile played on her lips. I hadn't heard from David or Susan, and I didn't expect to. Their chapter in my life was closed. My story was no longer about them. It was about me. It was about the woman who had found her way back from the silence, who had reclaimed her voice and her light. It was about the seeds I was planting in the soil and in the hearts of my new friends. My final chapters were not going to be a story of suffering. They were going to be a story of growth, of peace, and of a freedom I fought for and won. My hands were back in the earth, helping new things to flourish, and my spirit, at long last, was doing the same.